Hello and welcome, listeners, to this episode of Decisive Point, our new podcast series for the U.S. Army War College Press. The Decisive Point gets to the heart of the matter by featuring interviews with some of our most distinguished authors. Today, I would like to introduce Dr. Douglas Bristol, Jr., author of Living in Two Worlds, Change and Continuity in the Experience of African Americans in the U.S. Armed Forces Since World War II. This article appears in our autumn issue of Parameters. Dr. Bristol serves as a co-director of the Center for the Study of the Gulf South at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he is an associate professor of history. He is an historian of the African American experience. He is also a fellow at the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. His most recent book, Behind the Front Lines, explores how Black GIs used military service in World War II to claim the New Deal's promise of security. Welcome to Decisive Point, Doug.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You bet. Now tell us, please, what prompted your professional interest in the subject of two worlds in the U.S. military?
Well, the title, Living in Two Worlds, actually comes from an unprecedented video that the new Air Force Chief of Staff, General Charles Brown, posted on his Twitter feed. And an African American, he is really candid in sharing his experiences of living in two worlds, one that's white and one that's black, and all the discomfort that has caused him over time. And when I was trying to think of a way for this special issue to address current events, this video really seemed to capture that moment for the military, but it also speaks to a long-standing scholarly interest of mine, and that is documenting the experience of African Americans living with racism. This was very much the case in my first book, Knights of the Razor, which looked at 19th century Black barbers and who actually wrote about their experiences of what it was like to have close relationship with customers who were nevertheless very racist. And it also is a theme in the article, the chapter I wrote for my second book, Integrating the U.S. Military, where I looked at why were so many Black GIs rioting and protesting during World War II, and it gets to their anger over discrimination.
Right. And in your article, you discuss how some of the prejudices of individual service members affected our ability to understand the African American experience. Could you talk about that, elaborate on that, please, a little bit more for our listeners?
Right. So in the article, what I'm trying to do is to point out that even though there's a shelf full of books that look at this really tremendous achievement of the U.S. military, which is, I would argue, to create the most integrated institution in the United States, that scholarship really has neglected the everyday experience of African Americans. And as General Brown's comments reveal, a significant part of that experience is the experience of being regarded as different and less than for no other reason than the color of their skin. And so since historians have really not addressed this issue and don't really have a method for uncovering that, I'm drawing on the work of a sociologist named Irving Goffman, who is probably one of the most widely read and cited sociologists in the 20th century, and his theory of social stigma. And what's really innovative about his work is that he argues it's possible to analyze interactions between people to understand how discrimination works. And really his novel contribution is his definition of stigma is that stigma isn't something that, for example, comes with having darker colored skin. Stigma comes from the other person in interaction identifying a darker colored skin as something that makes you different and therefore inferior and therefore someone who should be subjected to discrimination. And that's how I look at the story I'm telling. It's really four stories, three from World War II. And of course, General Brown, I'm making that comparison. I use the theory of social stigma to look at the dynamics of those interactions. And there's been a recent trend among sociologists to think critically about how this theory can actually help us investigate racial discrimination and the experience of African Americans. And one of the key findings, and this goes into my conclusion for the article, is that individuals can cope with having a spoiled identity, as Irving Goffman says, because of racial stigma, but they can't really solve that problem. Those problems can only be solved collectively. And at the end of the article, I argue that General Brown, in his request that people join him in this conversation about their experiences with racism, is suggesting the military should take a collective response to dealing with the problem of bias and prejudice.
And obviously, this has been a persistent problem for the U.S. military. What recommendations would you have for modern day military leaders as far as addressing this problem?
The solution is simple. Military leaders need to listen to the concerns of African American service members, which is, of course, is General Brown's point. We can have lots of commissions, we can have scholars like myself come up with recommendations, but I believe that the sociologists are correct that what's really going to clear the air and convince people that just because someone's skin color is different, they should not be regarded as somehow different and less than, is going to be to hear from African Americans how those experiences of being regarded as different affects them. Because I think most people have good intentions, and if they really understand and educate themselves, that this problem can be solved.
Well, thank you very much for your insights today, Doug, and we wish you the best in your future research. And also thanks to our listeners as well. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Decisive Point.